Mirkwood was once a forest of light, a place where sunlight wove through the canopy in threads of gold and green, and every leaf shimmered as if touched by the faintest echo of song. Streams danced along moss-carpeted banks, carrying the murmur of unseen springs into quiet glades where creatures of all kinds wandered unafraid. In those earliest days, before shadows gathered like whispers along its borders, the forest possessed a kind of self-awareness, subtle yet unmistakable. It moved in rhythm with the lives it nurtured, responding to the footfalls of guardians, the flutter of wings, the cautious passage of deer. There was a sense of balance here, delicate but enduring, a harmonic resonance born of both the living trees and the latent magic that threaded through the roots, the stones and the soil itself. To enter Mirkwood then was to step into a living symphony, composed of light, sound, and the unspoken laws of being. Within this vibrant world, the first guardians took their silent oaths. They were beings of insight and foresight, attuned to the forest's subtle calls, the quiet notes that marked the pulse of its well-being. Elves with eyes like still pools and mortals gifted with uncanny perception wandered its edges, learning to move without disturbing the unseen currents that wove through the undergrowth. Their presence was gentle, never overbearing, yet definitive. It was their touch, their watchfulness, that allowed the forest to thrive without losing its inherent freedom. Even as they walked, these guardians sensed the delicate interplay of forces around them, the reciprocal care of tree and vine, predator and prey, light and shadow. Each decision, each act of protection, had consequences that rippled far beyond what any single mind could comprehend. And so the forest grew under their watch, golden and full, its promise of stability reassuring, yet quietly precarious. Magic in these days was not a tool or a weapon, but a language. It whispered in the rustle of leaves, in the gentle curling of river mist, in the way the air seemed to thicken with expectation before a rare bloom unfolded. The guardians learned to listen to these currents, to feel the resonance that guided them toward balance or warned of disturbance. Even the smallest infraction, a branch broken too sharply, a stone displaced carelessly, echoed through this network, subtle but instructive. It was in such minutiae that the first lessons of stewardship were etched, not in grand proclamations, but in attentiveness to the forest's quiet insistence on harmony. Yet even in this age of light, the first hints of vulnerability lingered, almost invisible, at the far edges of the forest, where the trees thinned and the streams began their uncertain descent toward distant lands. The air occasionally carried a chill that did not belong, a faint resonance of disquiet. No guardian spoke of it openly, but the most perceptive could sense the faint tremor beneath the surface, a shadow unformed yet patient, circling beyond sight. These early stirrings were subtle, often dismissed as wind or the natural melancholy of distant hills. Still, they were the first signals that Mirkwood's perfection, so carefully maintained, had its limits, and that forces outside its immediate comprehension were waiting. Creatures born within the forest's embrace knew only the light, and in their innocence they mirrored its rhythm. Birds called in measured cadences, insects hummed in delicate harmonies, and larger beasts moved with the ease of beings untroubled by fear. Each life was a thread in the greater tapestry, and together they composed an intricate, living pattern, whose beauty was fragile precisely because it was whole. The guardians, though vigilant, understood that this fragility demanded constant attention, a quiet patience that recognized the forest's intelligence as both guide and judge. It was within this delicate balance that Mirkwood's story began, not with war or ruin, but with harmony, with the subtle interweaving of life and awareness, guardians and forest, light and the faintest premonition of shadow. Before any corruption took root, before the first cracks marred the canopy, there was the purity of resonance, a golden forest breathing in rhythm with its inhabitants. Yet even here, the seeds of change were sown, invisible to the eye, but perceptible to the patient listener, the careful steward, and the forest itself. For Mirkwood, though shining and serene, was a living entity whose destiny would unfold slowly, inevitably, and with consequences that none could fully foresee. The guardians did not arrive all at once, nor were they chosen by decree. They came as if summoned by a rhythm only they could hear, drawn not by ambition but by attunement, those who through stillness or sorrow had learned to move with the breathing world. Some were elves, graceful and grave, whose lives extended like slow rivers beneath starlight. Others were mortal, marked not by longevity but by depth, bearing within them an instinctual reverence that could not be taught. These were not rulers, nor warriors in the conventional sense. They were the forest's interpreters, its caretakers, its quiet stewards, who understood that to protect something ancient one must first learn to listen to its silence. They walked among the trees not as masters but as companions, learning the weight of silence before sound, the meaning of shadows before light. Their vows were unspoken, forged in moments of communion rather than ceremony. A hand placed on bark that pulsed faintly with warmth. A stream crossed at dusk where the water carried no reflection. They lived without proclamation, building nothing, altering nothing, allowing the forest to continue being what it was, an echo of the world's earliest memory. But Mirkwood, even then, required vigilance. For while the heart of the forest thrummed with light, the edges had begun to fray. Foreign things crept inward, not malicious, not yet, but bearing a rhythm unfamiliar to the land's ancient pulse. Travelers brought fire where none was needed. Songs were sung that did not align with the forest's cadence. In these moments, the guardians did not respond with punishment. Instead, they responded with presence. One would walk beside the intruder, silent but steady, until the forest itself urged retreat. Another would linger beside a campsite, letting the unnatural warmth of flame meet the deeper stillness of loam and mist. Correction through contrast, guidance without words, and yet even this patient watchfulness had limits. The guardians began to differ, not in devotion but in interpretation. Some believed that Mirkwood must be preserved through distance, untouched, even unseen. Others argued for guidance, for measured contact, believing that the forest's essence could influence rather than isolate. These were not loud arguments. They happened across long stretches of silence, in moments when the trees swayed but no wind blew. But the differences were real, and in time they grew. One such debate took root at the forest's southeastern edge, where the trees began to thin and a peculiar restlessness stirred beneath the soil. Here, a mortal guardian named Erethan built a stone cairn, a marker, he claimed, to guide respectful passage. He stacked the stones with precision, each layer an offering, each placement accompanied by whispered intent. But others saw this as intrusion, a signal to the outside world that the forest could be mapped, measured, softened. They did not remove the cairn, but they never touched it again. It remained an unmoving question, growing heavier with each passing season. This was the beginning of division, not a schism of allegiance but of method. As more of the outer world brushed against Mirkwood's fringe, the guardians found themselves interpreting its silence differently. Was a broken branch a cry for defense or a test of tolerance? Was a wandering child a danger or an invitation? With no central doctrine, only shared intuition, the guardians' paths began to diverge. Some withdrew deeper into the heartwood, becoming myth. Others stayed near the edges, speaking in riddles to those who approached, and in the gap between them, the forest began to absorb uncertainty. Even the creatures noticed. Birds that once nested openly now chose higher branches, deeper shadows. Foxes shifted their paths. The great owls, silent judges of canopy law, turned their heads more slowly, as if unsure what they were now watching. The forest was not yet cursed, but it had become conflicted. And within this conflict, something else stirred. In a glade west of the cairn, a circle of elder trees began to lean inward, subtly, over many moons. At their center, a pool once clear as starlight began to darken. Not with rot, but with reflection. Shadows appeared where none should be. Dreams murmured at its edge even when the air was still. The guardians who passed through it felt unease, but none spoke of it aloud. They had learned that naming a thing too early could give it strength, and so they waited, watched, and returned to their solitary rounds, each hoping that silence would suffice. But silence, though sacred, is not always safety, for the forest was listening, and not only to them. Other ears had begun to attune to its ancient resonance, ears that twisted meaning, that drank from stillness only to echo it back with distortion. They had not entered yet, but their attention was a pressure against the bark, a pulse beneath the soil, something patient, something watching. The guardians had not yet failed, but they had faltered through difference, through doubt, through the quiet erosion of unity. And Mirkwood, ever responsive, began to shift accordingly. By the time the leaves began to change in patterns, no season had taught them. The first cracks in Mirkwood's canopy had already formed. They did not split the forest with thunder or flame, but unfolded like quiet misalignments, branches bending in directions contrary to the wind, glades shifting in memory, paths once trusted leading to strange, unfamiliar turns. The guardians noticed, but none could trace the origin. What had once been a place of deep rhythm now pulsed with irregularities, soft as heartbeat murmurs, easy to dismiss, until one began to listen more closely. The southeastern cairn had shifted. No one admitted to touching it, but the uppermost stone had fallen and cracked in two, revealing a narrow spiral carved into its underside. It had not been there before. Erathan stood beside it one morning, his gaze unreadable, and whispered something into the earth before walking west and never returning to the border. Those who found the cairn afterward felt a strange vibration in the soil beneath their feet, a slow pulse, like breath trapped in stone. Along the outer trails, travelers began to speak of disorientation. They would swear they followed marked paths, only to find themselves looping endlessly, the same tree appearing again and again, its bark now etched with a dark sap that dripped though no wound could be seen. Others claimed to hear fluting tones just beyond perception, music with no melody, as though something deep beneath the roots had begun to hum, in a language long forgotten. One elven guardian, Ilyarian, ventured into a northern grove, where the grass had dulled to a silver gray. She moved carefully, leaving no footprints, but found the birds had gone silent, and even the wind refused to enter. In the center of that grove stood a tree, unlike any other blackened bark, but not burned, as though the color had been drawn inward. Its branches reached not up, but down, like the arms of a creature clinging to the sky's memory. When Ilyarian pressed her palm to its trunk, she felt nothing, not cold, not warmth, not welcome, just a void where resonance should have been. She left a marker at its roots, 3 smooth stones placed in a crescent, a signal to the others. But when she returned days later, the stones were gone, and in their place lay a single feather, translucent and rigid, as if carved from ice that would not melt. She did not return again. She said nothing, but from that day, her songs once sung quietly to the trees ceased altogether. These changes were not attacks, they were misalignments. The forest was not dying, but shifting, its internal laws bending slowly under an unseen pressure. The Guardians convened for the first time in decades, not in word but in presence, gathering in a silent ring around a shallow glade of still water. No vote was taken, no course of action decided, but each could feel the uncertainty rising like mist between them. Some began to craft new wards, simple arrangements of stone, water, and ash meant to harmonize troubled regions. Others called for deeper silence, believing the forest required less intervention, not more. One guardian, whose name had long since been shed, placed his hands into the soil and remained unmoving for 7 days. When he finally rose, he spoke only this: "The forest is dreaming, and we are not in the dream." He left that same hour, walking into the western deep, and was not seen again. Outside the forest, rumors grew. Traders who skirted its edge whispered of creatures with too many eyes, or none at all, watching from just beyond the bramble. Hunters returned with meat that rotted before it could be salted. One tale told of a child who wandered too close and returned different, silent with a gaze that seemed fixed, not on the world, but behind it. The Guardians, once bound by shared rhythm, now followed diverging instincts. Some withdrew completely, becoming indistinct from the trees themselves. Others reached out to those beyond the forest, seeking knowledge, relics, even bargains that might restore the balance they no longer understood. It was not betrayal, it was divergence. But divergence in a forest like Mirkwood does not go unnoticed, for Mirkwood is not passive. It responds, it reflects, and in its reflection, it reveals. In a southern hollow, a stag with golden antlers drank from a stream that no longer led anywhere. Its breath formed no mist, its hooves left no mark, and when it turned its gaze to the east, where the heart of the forest once glowed brightest, its eyes shimmered not with fear, but with recognition. The forest had begun to change, not by force, but by invitation. Quiet disruptions, small misreadings, layered over time until the canopy itself no longer remembered the shape of its own light. And still the question deepened like a well. What force had answered the forest's early fractures with such intimate precision? It began in the east, where the air had always been thinner, the light more filtered, and the winds that passed through the trees carried a hush that was not silence, but waiting. There at the fringe where the forest's golden breath once turned cool with twilight, something shifted. Not a figure, not a storm, just a density in the air, as though something invisible had taken root and begun to inhale. The Guardians had no name for it, but they knew its weight. They called it the first shadow, though none could say when precisely it arrived. It left no footprints, cast no silhouette, and spoke in no voice. It did not rush, but accumulated. Moss began to grow upward along tree trunks, creeping toward the light as though seeking warmth that no longer reached the forest floor. Pools that once reflected the sky began to ripple even without wind, distorting their surfaces as if responding to something unseen above. Leaves twisted subtly along the edges, curling not in drought or rot but in quiet reluctance. Animals behaved differently. The birds no longer sang before dawn, but after, short, clipped notes that ended before they began. Deer, once known to walk openly in the glades, now paused at invisible borders, sensing thresholds their hooves refused to cross. And in some parts of the undergrowth, mushrooms bloomed with unusual haste, their caps colored like dried blood or soot, and they pulsed faintly when moonlight touched them, as though breathing. Among the Guardians, the change was not discussed in open council, but it was felt. They walked differently now, slower, as if listening for something they did not want to find. Illyarion, who once sang freely, now moved in silence. Irathan was still gone. Others drifted deeper, losing their names to the trees. and a few, just a few, began to dream in ways they could not recall upon waking. Yet they awoke unsettled, their hands trembling, their breath shallow. When they walked, they found their steps leading to the same places, again and again, old glades that no longer opened, stone rings that no longer hummed. At the forest center, light grew pale, not dim but diluted, as though filtered through ash suspended in the very air. Guardians who ventured too close to certain groves returned, altered eyes wide, voices slow, and for days afterward their presence would mute bird song and still the leaves around them. One left a message carved into a fallen tree before vanishing. It is not darkness, it is listening. The forest was not empty, but it was becoming occupied, not by armies or beasts, but by intent. Something had noticed the fractures between the guardians, the lapses in their rituals, the spaces where certainty had once held firm. It moved not like a storm, but like sap, slow, sticky, impossible to remove once touched. And where it passed, the forest remembered it. Trees bent toward it. Stones held its cold longer than they should. Water carried its echo down into roots that drank without resistance. The guardians, sensing this deepening shift, turned to their old mechanisms. They performed the ancient rituals, not to banish, for they did not yet know what to name, but to reinforce circles of ash, songs without words, offerings of breath and silence. But the resonance no longer responded, where once the forest pulsed in reply. A rustle, a glimmer, a warmth. Now there was only stillness. The rituals still echoed, but the forest no longer answered. And so they began to wonder, in quiet solitude, whether they had been too late. The first shadow did not spread like fire. It threaded itself between things. It did not destroy the trees. It thickened the space between them. It did not silence the birds. It altered their reason for singing. The creatures that emerged from the edge were not monstrous, not at first, but uncanny. A fox with two still eyes, a hare that never blinked, a buck that stood unmoving at the river's edge for an entire day, and then vanished without a ripple. One morning, before the sun rose fully, a child's voice echoed through a part of the forest no longer traveled. It was not a scream, it was a song, soft, circular, repeating the same 3 notes in a pattern none could place. No children lived that deep within the wood. None had for many years. Those who heard it did not speak of it aloud, but they did not forget it either. It was then that a few of the guardians began to retreat entirely, not from the forest, but from the role they once held within it, not in defiance, but in despair. Their silence was not protest, but surrender. They watched the moss creep higher, the bark darken, the air thicken, and they let it happen. Whatever had entered Mirkwood had not come as a conqueror. It had arrived as a presence, responding not to resistance, but to hesitation. It had filled the space the guardians had left open, not by force, but by invitation. Not one extended aloud, but offered in doubt, and doubt was all it needed. So the forests changed, not all at once, not evenly, but unmistakably, and still no name had been given to what had entered. In the weeks that followed the forest's quiet turn, the guardians who remained began to fracture, not in loyalty, but in vision. For though they all saw the same signs, the twisting moss, the mirrored pools that reflected only shadow, the creatures that watched but did not blink, they did not agree on what those signs meant, nor on how they should be answered. The old harmony that once linked them, subtle as bird song through mist, had unraveled into threads of isolated conviction. Some called for containment. They believed the darkness, though unnamed, was still bounded, still responsive to older rites and ancient geometries. They gathered in moonlit glades and etched runes into the roots of trees, reciting invocations passed down in whispers from the First Age. Their belief was simple. If the forest had bent, it could be straightened. If it had darkened, light could be coaxed back in. Their circles grew tighter, more frequent, more desperate. Others argued for retreat. They saw in the forest not an enemy, but a transformation. To them, Mirkwood was not being corrupted. It was evolving, shedding one nature for another. They spoke of inevitability, of time's slow pivot, of the arrogance in thinking the guardians could stop what had already begun. These voices moved deeper into the wood, seeking communion with whatever now pulsed at its heart, convinced that understanding required surrender. Between them stood a third kind, the uncertain, those who felt the pull of both instincts. They maintained the old paths, kept watch on the cairns and the sacred clearings, but their hearts were divided. They no longer sang. Their silences were longer, their sleep more fragmented. In their dreams the forest spoke, but not in words. It showed them roots coiling around empty thrones, trees shedding their bark like skin, pools in which their own reflections turned away. The most visible fracture came quietly. A guardian named Thalowen, once regarded for her calm presence, performed a ritual near the banks of a blackened stream, an offering of bread, light, and song. She waited, as custom dictated, for the forest's subtle reply. But none came. In its place rose a windless shiver, and the stream reversed its flow for a single moment, curling back upon itself like a breath inhaled too sharply. She stepped back, unsettled, and marked the site with a woven cord of pine and ash. The next morning it was gone. In its place stood a circle of stones, perfectly smooth, each etched with a mark none could read. When she returned to the circle a second time, her hair turned white by nightfall. She did not speak again. Word of the event passed among the guardians without alarm, but it carried weight. Some took it as a warning, others a beckoning. And still, no one agreed. No central gathering was called. No final decision made. Instead, each acted according to their own rhythm, and in doing so, the unity that once defined them dissolved like mist at dusk. The forest responded accordingly. Its borders grew indistinct. Trails that once obeyed memory now looped into themselves, leading wanderers back to the same place, though the trees around them were different each time. Voices echoed longer than they should. Light lingered in places where the sun had already set, and in other places dusk arrived before midday. Birds nested in silence. Frogs sang beneath ice. The rules had not been broken, they had been rewritten. It was during this unraveling that the first of the relic places vanished. The glade of a cord, where oaths were once bound with leaf and breath, was found one morning to be missing, not destroyed, not overgrown, simply absent. The space remained. The trees curved inward as before. The wind stilled in its familiar hush. But at the glade's center, where the standing stones once ringed a pool of still water, there was now only earth, undisturbed, untouched, as if nothing had ever stood there. The guardians who visited it returned in silence, each convinced of a different truth. One claimed the forest had erased a memory it no longer needed. Another believed the glade had been claimed by a presence asserting dominion over sacred sites. A third said nothing at all, only placed a branch in the soil where the pool once shimmered, and wept without sound. And so, the covenants began to fracture, not all at once, but with a deep, invisible slowness. Rituals were performed out of sequence. Songs once sung together became solo laments. Guardians passed one another without recognition, each walking paths now known only to themselves. And the forest, always listening, absorbed every silence, every misstep, every faltering note. It did not rage, it did not warn, it simply accepted, and in that acceptance something grew. At the center of Mirkwood, beneath roots tangled like veins around a forgotten altar, a pulse had begun to form. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, measured, as if something had heard the Guardians break faith with one another, and had taken that breach as permission, not to conquer, not to rule, but to enter. Not all who remained near the forest's edge noticed the change in sound. To most it seemed a silence, a hush fallen like dust over the glades. But to those who listened with the patience of the old Guardians, it was not silence, it was whispering, not from mouths or wind or stream, but from the forest itself. The trees had begun to murmur. At first the sounds were faint, like breath caught in bark or the rustle of leaves without motion. Then, gradually, they became more specific, cracks in the wood that followed no wind, creaks in roots that pulsed beneath the earth, a kind of phrasing in the calls of birds that once sang at random, now repeating notes with uncanny symmetry. Mirkwood had found its voice, but it did not speak in language. It spoke in rhythm, in tone, in pattern. It had become a forest that listened, and in its listening had learned to echo. Travelers spoke of words they could not recall hearing. Some claimed to have had conversations with no memory of the speaker. Others woke from dreamless sleep certain they had been given instructions. A woodcutter who ventured too close to the southern slope returned pale and quiet, having left his tools behind. He could not say why. He only knew the trees had hummed as he passed, and that something in him had shifted. For the Guardians who remained, the transformation was more intimate. They had lived in tune with Mirkwood for generations. Now the tune had changed. One Guardian, LOTR, once known for her flute song, sat in the crook of an ancient elm and tried to play a melody she had composed long before the shadows came. But the sound faltered. The notes refused to hold. Every time she played, the forest echoed something back. Not discordant, not mocking, but different. It was as though the forest had learned her song and was now altering it according to its own logic. The melodies drifted upward into branches that no longer swayed, disappearing into a stillness too deep to be natural. The whispers were not commands, not threats. They were invitations. They suggested paths where none had existed. They coaxed wanderers off the trail, not with fear, but with familiarity. A distant voice repeating their name, a remembered lullaby heard among the ferns, a scent from childhood blooming unexpectedly beneath thorn. Mirkwood was no longer merely transforming, it was guiding, and those who followed found that the forest always led them inward. Deeper within, the changes grew stranger. Places once thought fixed, now drifted, not physically, but perceptually. The same clearing would appear differently depending on the time of day, or the mood of the one who entered it. A pool might show stars in the daylight. A tree might bleed sap only when touched. The forest was learning its visitors and mirroring them, not with precision, but with intent, as though it were building a language made of memory, doubt, and longing. Those who resisted the whispers fared no better than those who followed. A young scout from beyond the southern border wandered in one dusk and was found days later, standing beside a circle of mushrooms with tears drying on her cheeks. She could not recall her own name, but she had carved a phrase into the bark of a nearby tree: not lost, found elsewhere. The Guardians could no longer rely on each other. Some heard nothing, others heard too much. A few began to imitate the forest's echoes, speaking in repetition, humming in their sleep. One wrote lines of unknown script into the soil with his fingertips and vanished before sunrise. Another awoke one morning unable to speak at all, as though her words had been drawn from her overnight and dispersed into the trees. Yet through all this, there was no aggression. The forest did not hunt, it did not harm. It absorbed, it enveloped, its whispers grew into a form of guidance. Not to safety, but to transformation. It was as if Mirkwood had recognized its own fracture and was now reassembling itself, not as it had been, but as something new, something fluent in both shadow and light, something that did not fear contradiction, but welcomed it. Still, some among the Guardians believed they could intervene. They believed the whispers could be mapped, that the new voice of the forest could be reasoned with, even redirected. They began to mark the trees with counter-symbols, sigils of silence, glyphs meant to mute echo and restore stillness, but the marks would fade within days, not erased, absorbed, as though the forest had read them, considered them, and responded by integrating their resistance. And beneath it all, deeper than roots and wind, a new resonance grew, a low tone almost inaudible, that vibrated through the stones and the marrow of the trees. It did not speak. It was not song. It was presence, and it pulsed in rhythm with the forest's breath. Something was listening, and now it had begun to answer in full. They came quietly, these stories, not as legend or song, but as murmurs passed between those who still dwelled near the forest's edge, half-spoken, half-remembered, coated in the haze of disbelief. They were tales of ruin, yes, but not of war or storm. These were slower tragedies, quieter undoings, and they all began the same way, with someone who wandered just a little too far. There was the healer from the southern village, known for gathering herbs at dawn. One morning she entered Mirkwood to harvest moonroot, a flower that only bloomed in shadow. She returned before nightfall, but her basket was empty. Her hands trembled as she spoke of a clearing filled with lightless blossoms that hummed softly when touched. She claimed to have seen a figure standing at the clearing's edge, tall and unmoving, not cloaked in shadow, but made of it. After that day, she never entered the forest again. Within a year, her sight failed. Her last words, whispered to no one in particular, were, "The forest sees you back." Another tale came from a hunter, seasoned and scarred, who found his way deep into a glade not marked on any map. There, he claimed, trees grew in spirals curving around a hollow that pulsed like a living heart. He shot no game that day, nor any day after. When pressed, he could not explain what he had seen, only that it had been listening to him long before he realized it. And then there was the boy. He was no more than 10 summers old, bright-eyed and curious, a child of the woodland edge who often played near the boundary where the tall grass met the forest floor. One evening, when the mist hung low and golden through the trees, he stepped too far past the line his mother had taught him never to cross. He returned 3 days later. His face was pale, his eyes strangely distant, and he did not speak for a full month. When at last he opened his mouth, it was to sing a lullaby that no one in the village recognized, a song not sad but solemn, gentle, circular, as though it had no beginning and no end. He said he had met a girl in the woods who taught it to him. When asked where she lived, he simply pointed toward the trees and said, "She has no house, only silence." He died the following winter, without illness or wound, as though his heart had simply forgotten its rhythm. These stories were not the forest's wrath. They were not punishments. They were fragments, glimpses of something vast, moving just beneath the veil of reason. Each tale was an echo of the same rhythm. Someone entered, something shifted, and the cost was not always death, but a slow unraveling of the self. The Guardians, those who still watched from within, began to record these accounts, not as warnings, but as confirmations. The forest's reach had changed. It no longer waited to be entered. It had begun to extend itself outward in ways subtle and strange. Dreams shifted among villagers. Some heard whispers in wells. Others saw shadowed figures on the edges of their vision, always gone when looked at directly. The threshold had moved. One guardian, an Aryan, took it upon herself to trace the paths of these tales. She followed the healer's route, walked the hunter's spiral, stood in the field where the boy had pointed. In each place she left behind tokens, braided grass, riverstone charms, fragments of old songs. She hoped to remind the forest of its beginnings, to root its memory in light. But the tokens vanished within days, and once, when she returned to the spiral grove, she found her own name etched faintly into the bark of a tree she had never touched. She wept not from fear, but recognition. The forest no longer received offerings. It returned them. Mirkwood had begun to curate its own memory. The glades were no longer just spaces of nature. They were theaters of reflection, tailored to the intruder's history, reshaped to meet them with something familiar twisted ever so slightly out of place. A loved one's voice altered, a cherished scent rotting at its edges. These were not attacks. They were reinterpretations. The forest was composing stories of its own now, and the characters did not always survive the retelling. Among the guardians, the question deepened like a well no stone could fill. Was Mirkwood still responding to presence, or had it begun to create? Had the forest, once vessel, become author? The tales once dismissed as coincidence became scripture among those who dared remain, not because they offered answers, but because they repeated with such precision, such inevitability, that to deny them felt like defying gravity. And through them, a pattern emerged. Each tale ended the same way, with something lost. A voice, a name, a memory, a breath. The forest no longer needed to consume. It only needed to rewrite. What does a land become when its memory no longer belongs to the living? They did not mark the moment it began. No trumpet of calamity, no thunderous shift beneath the canopy. Only a hush, heavier than silence, settling over the forest's center. The trees grew denser here, their trunks gnarled and leaning inward as if drawn by a common breath. Light no longer passed cleanly through the leaves. It diffused gray and uneven, filtering down like ash through stagnant air. Beneath that canopy at the exact heart of Mirkwood, something had changed in full. The ground here was damp, but not with rain. Moisture clung to the roots like memory, thick and cold as though the soil no longer drank but hoarded. The trees stood close, shoulder to shoulder, their bark blackened though no fire had touched them. Their leaves trembled without wind. Insects moved in erratic circles. A faint hum, low and constant, vibrated through the moss, an ancient tone with no source, as though the forest were remembering something too long buried. This was the place the guardians came to fear. They called it the Cursed Heart, though none could agree on who named it first. They did not approach it willingly. Some could not even see it. Paths twisted away, glades refused passage, and those who insisted on entry often found themselves walking for hours only to return to where they had begun. Bones aching, mind fogged, but a few succeeded, or believed they had. Anarian was one. She marked her way with copper tokens, each engraved with a glyph of direction, nailed to trees in a spiral that led inward. For days she walked, never sleeping in the same place twice, never speaking aloud. When she reached the center, she did not weep, she did not kneel, she only stood, listening. The ground beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as if breathing through stone. The air smelled of old iron and wet leaves. She whispered her name once, as was custom, and the forest echoed it back, but altered, hollowed, missing the syllables that carried warmth. She turned to leave, only to find her tokens gone. The path behind her was no longer a spiral, but a circle. It took her 3 days to escape. When she returned to the others, she would speak only in fragments. It is not a place. It is a memory. Not ours. Not waiting. She marked her skin with black ink spirals within spirals, and lived alone from that day forward. The cursed heart did not lash out. It drew inward. It was not a fire, not a wound. It was an inversion, a place where the logic of light had unraveled, where time bent subtly, where the forest had turned itself inward in an act of self-preservation or self-erasure. No guardian had seen the animals that lived there, but signs of them appeared, bone piles arranged in deliberate lines, feather clusters placed at the base of trees, nests woven with strands of hair, all positioned with intention, as if they too were obeying something unseen. A whisper traveled through the forest, not in sound but in instinct. This place could not be healed. It could only be contained. And so the guardians built their last circle, not of stone or fire, but of presence. 7 of them, spaced evenly along the forest's inner radius, bound themselves to the trees in a ritual older than their names. Each whispered a word of forgetting, of shelter, of sealing. They closed their eyes and breathed in the forest's scent one last time. When they exhaled, the air thickened, the birds went still, the wind did not pass through. The cursed heart did not retreat. It quieted. The hum diminished. The spirals unwound slightly. For a time, days, perhaps months, the forest softened. The old songs returned to the edges, the trails straightened. The light returned in dappled patches, weak but warm. Those beyond the wood whispered that the curse had passed, that Mirkwood, though changed, had survived its own storm. But the guardians knew better. What had taken root in the center was not vanquished. It had merely been acknowledged. It had been given space. For some, this was a victory. For others, a delay. The cursed heart remained, a stillness within the rhythm, a silence too deep to be natural. No map could contain it. No spell could name it. But all who had touched the forest's breath knew it was there, and in knowing, they changed. The forest now had a core it could not forget, a center that refused to be undone. And from that center, even in stillness, something radiated outward, not malevolent, not benign, just waiting. What happens when the heart of a forest decides to remember itself, even as the world around it forgets? They gathered not in unity, but in need. Those few guardians who remained, weathered by silence, reshaped by failure, came together beneath a canopy gone dull with age. The trees above them no longer whispered guidance. They merely loomed, listening. The forest was still, not in peace, but in patience, as though waiting for them to speak a language none of them remembered. They had tried ritual. They had tried silence. Now they came with one final instinct, to act, not to preserve, but to contain what had already taken root. Anarian, her skin still marked with spirals from the cursed heart, stepped forward first. She laid a relic at the forest's edge, a fragment of obsidian once buried beneath the eastern river, carved long ago with runes meant to bind. She did not explain it. No one asked. The others followed her gesture, each placing tokens on the ground, a vial of river light, a braid of hair from a vanished guardian, a folded map that no longer led anywhere. These were not weapons. They were offerings of loss. The idea was not to purge the shadow, but to seal it, to press the growing hunger of the cursed heart inward, to slow its quiet expansion. They believed, or perhaps only hoped, that by encircling the forest with these echoes of what had been good, they might draw a boundary it would not cross. But hope is not a mechanism, and Mirkwood had learned to listen more deeply than they had ever known. The relics faded. Not quickly. One by one they vanished. Not consumed, not stolen, replaced. The vial of river light became a smooth, empty shell of grey glass. The braid turned into ash that scattered without wind. The map unfolded itself and bled ink until the page was blank. Anarian's obsidian shard cracked, its runes rearranging in patterns that none could read. The forest had not rejected their offering. It had rewritten it. Some guardians interpreted this as a response, others as a warning. Still others insisted it was proof that action must be taken not with reverence, but with strength, and so came the interventions. The first was a ring of fire, lit at the forest's western fringe by a guardian named Kauros, who believed that purifying heat might halt the spread. He circled a grove known to echo the tone of the cursed heart and set it alight. The flames rose clean and high. The trees did not scream, they crumbled inward like closing eyes. When the fire died, the grove was gone, but so was Kauros. No ash, no bones, only his staff, stuck upright in the scorched soil, vibrating faintly with the same tone that had once pulsed beneath the moss. The second was a chant, an invocation of stillness, recited not by voice, but through vibration. A leader, the flute-bearer, worked with a cluster of old sentinels and carved tuning hollows into the trees, meant to resonate a single, sustained note through the forest's root system. She played it once at dusk. The trees sang in answer, a low harmonic thrum that traveled miles. For a moment it worked. The spiral stopped. The light cleared. But by morning the hollows had sealed themselves, the trees closing around them as though never altered, and Elia no longer played. Her flute, when lifted to her lips, would not sound. The air passed through her hands without music. Others tried subtler measures, smoke rituals, mirror wards, paths of salt and iron. But nothing held, not because the forest resisted, but because it did not oppose. It absorbed, it adapted, it accepted. The truth became undeniable. The cursed heart had not been imprisoned, it had been instructed, and now it listened more keenly. Every failed ritual became a note in its symphony. Every ward turned backward on itself. Every protective glyph began to pulse faintly with a tone the guardians did not place. In this, the forest was not merely surviving. It was learning. And so the interventions stopped, not from exhaustion, but from understanding. The guardians, few as they were, gathered once more, not to plan, but to witness. They stood on the edge of a glade where the light bent in strange angles, where leaves grew silver in moonlight and black in day, and where a single pool reflected not sky, but memory. In that still water, each saw something different, a lost name, a broken oath, a face that should not have aged. They said nothing. They simply turned one by one and walked away. The forest made no move to stop them. From that day, no further actions were taken to halt the cursed heart. No fires lit, no symbols drawn. It was not surrender, it was recognition. That what now lived at the forest's center was not an infection, but a conclusion, one they had helped write, even in their silence. And beneath the soil, deeper than their oldest rites could reach, something pulsed in rhythm with their every step. In the years that followed the Guardian's retreat, Mirkwood changed beyond recognition. The air thickened with a sweetness that dulled the mind, and travelers who passed too close to its borders spoke of seeing movement where none should be. The forest no longer sought secrecy, it radiated presence. Birds still flew above its canopy, but their paths curved away, as though repelled by something unseen. The outer trees leaned outward now, bending from the center as if the very heart of the wood pressed against them, slow and relentless. Villages along the perimeter adapted in silence. Some built stone markers, turning them toward the forest like eyes in prayer. Others abandoned their homes entirely, unable to bear the dreams that came in waves, visions of roots crawling through floorboards, of branches tapping at closed shutters as though seeking entry. Those who stayed learned not to speak of Mirkwood after dusk. It was not fear that silenced them, but reverence, a quiet, inherited understanding that the forest was no longer a place, but a boundary between memory and forgetting. For the forest, too, had learned. It no longer spoke only to those who entered. It whispered to those who remembered it. Names once tied to glades or clearings faded from maps. Streams changed their course, and paths that once led to sacred sites now ended in still ponds that reflected only sky. It was as though the forest was reordering the world around it, erasing evidence of its earlier light, sculpting itself into something neither cursed nor pure, only complete. Anarion lived longest among the few who remained faithful to the watch. Her dwelling stood just beyond the reach of the outer vines, where the soil remained dry and the air thin. Each morning she woke to the sound of the forest's slow breathing. It had a rhythm now measured, tidal, like the drawing of a great lung beneath the earth. She kept a record, carved not in ink but in shallow lines upon polished stone. Every seventh night she ventured to the edge, and laid her palm upon the bark of the nearest oak. It always pulsed beneath her touch. One dawn she found a feather lying across her threshold. It was black, glistening faintly with moisture, though no dew had fallen. When she lifted it, a whisper passed through her, not from without, but from within. "You are part of what remains." She burned it in her hearth, but the smoke drifted outward against the wind toward the forest. And so the line between watcher and watched dissolved. The guardians had long believed themselves separate, agents of balance, observers of consequence, but Mirkwood no longer acknowledged the division. It absorbed their memory, their rituals, their symbols. Their oaths became indistinguishable from the hum of the soil. The forest's will, once shaped by covenant, now existed by inertia. It was not guided by malice or mercy. It simply endured, an organism vast enough to remember everything and forgive nothing. On rare nights, the cursed heart revealed itself, not visibly, but perceptibly. A tremor would ripple through the forest floor, subtle as breath, and those within miles could feel it in their bones. Some mistook it for thunder, others for dream. But those attuned to the old ways knew the forest was speaking to itself again, not in pain, in reflection. A traveler from the northern realms passed near the border once, drawn by curiosity. He wrote of trees that appeared to bend toward him, of air that shimmered as if filled with invisible heat. He claimed to hear laughter carried on the wind, low, mournful, almost human. When he returned to civilization, he spoke of a forest that seemed alive in a way that defied comprehension. He said it was no longer cursed, but awake. His writings ended with a single line, "I do not think it sleeps at all." And yet, within this unsettling consciousness, life persisted. Moss grew thick on stones where no light reached. Owls built nests in the hollows of trees untouched by time. Tiny flowers, colorless and luminous, bloomed along the edges of stagnant pools. They carried no scent, but when brushed, they released a faint vibration, as if echoing the heartbeat that lay beneath the forest's soil. Mirkwood, in its strange equilibrium, had birthed a new ecosystem, one that neither feared shadow nor sought light. To the few who still remembered its golden age, this was tragedy. To the forest, it was resolution. When Anarion died, her body was never found. Her dwelling remained intact, her carvings unfinished, her stone records arranged as if awaiting her return. Only one change marked her passing. A sapling grew through the center of her floor, its leaves silver on one side, black on the other. Those who came after would call it the sentinel tree, believing it to be a sign that the forest had claimed her at last. But those who listened closely to its leaves swore they heard something different, a woman's voice, faint but steady, whispering words of remembrance. Thus, Mirkwood settled into its final rhythm, neither dying nor thriving, but remembering, its edges held fast against intrusion, yet its influence seeped outward through dream, and even those who had never seen its trees could feel it, as if some distant part of their mind had walked its paths once before. The forest was no longer golden, no longer cursed. It was both, and in that balance lay a truth no guardian had spoken aloud. Perhaps the shadow had never been an enemy at all, but a mirror. And so Mirkwood endured, vast and silent, humming softly beneath moonlight and mist. In the last years before the final silence fell over Mirkwood's inner groves, there came a moment when the forest reached outward, not with force, but with a quiet proposition. It did not take the shape of thunder or flame, nor did it announce itself in dreams or omens. It arrived as a pact offered not to kings or sages, but to the few who had not yet turned away. Of the remaining watchers, only 3 still walked the periphery with purpose. They did not speak often. Their names had grown soft in memory, like leaves pressed into old parchment. One of them, a woman once called Marin, began to notice something peculiar, a gathering of stones in the shape of a crescent moon near the roots of the sentinel tree. They had not been placed by any hand she knew, yet they matched the pattern from an ancient rite. One meant not to bind, but to merge. She said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th, she returned and found the stones rearranged into a circle. Within it lay a strand of silver bark, thin as thread, curled into a spiral. Marin understood it as an answer, or perhaps an invitation. In the old days, the forest's voice had been coaxed, evoked through song and gesture. Now it spoke in arrangement, in shape and memory. The pact it proposed was not written or declared. It was simply there, inscribed in the patterns of root, wind, stone, and time. The forest, it seemed, no longer sought guardians. It sought communion. The watchers knew such an alignment could not be entered lightly. What the forest offered was not alliance, but assimilation. To bind with it now meant more than service. It meant surrender, to become part of the pulse, the memory, the rootwork that had grown stranger and deeper since the birth of the cursed heart. Still, one among them chose to answer. He was called Thalen in his younger years, though the name no longer passed his lips. His days were spent tracing the perimeters of groves that no longer obeyed direction, recording shifts in the angle of branches, the migration of light. He believed that to map a thing even in its change was to understand its intent. On the morning of the first frost, Thalen entered the circle of stones. He knelt beside the spiral of bark and placed his hand upon it. He spoke no words. The forest did not require them. Instead, he closed his eyes and exhaled once, slow and steady, offering the breath of his years. The change was not immediate, but those who passed near that glade in the weeks that followed reported the sensation of being observed, not watched, but remembered, as though the trees carried within them the imprint of Thalen's mind, his questions, his grief. Birds no longer sang above that space, but wind passed through it with a harmony that seemed shaped by thought. Marin did not follow him. She remained at the edge, tending to the records Thalen had left behind. She wrote with fingers trembling from age, carving the last of the known forest paths into stone. But over time, the paths shifted faster than she could inscribe them. The forest, it seemed, no longer wished to be known, only felt. The final pact, then, was not a moment, it was a process. Slowly, inevitably, the forest began to incorporate the last fragments of those who had once tended it. A song once sung by Illyarion echoed in the calls of birds with no names. A ritual once practiced by Ilyar reappeared in the spirals of vines around sleeping trees. Even Anarion's old stone records, buried in a collapsed grove, were mirrored in the branching patterns of moss across the northern banks. Mirkwood was not forgetting. It was internalizing. Where once the Guardians had shaped the forest through their presence, now the forest shaped itself through their echoes. And in doing so it ceased to distinguish between watcher and watched, between oath and instinct. From this new union came a subtle transformation. The cursed heart, once a concentrated anomaly, began to diffuse, not in decay, but in resonance. Its rhythms spread outward, no longer confined to a single place. It became the heartbeat of the forest entire, slow, immense, steady. Not all could hear it, but those who did said it brought not dread, but quiet clarity, as though the forest at last had found peace within its contradiction. And yet, there remained a price. Those who entered after the pact found no warnings, no resistance. The forest allowed them passage. But when they returned, if they returned, they carried with them something altered, a silence in their voice, a distant quality in their gaze, as though a part of them had been left behind, not taken, but willingly shed. It became known as the Last Accord, a covenant not made in desperation, but in recognition that the Guardians could not restore the forest, and the forest could not forget them, and so they became one, not through conquest or command, but through convergence. The price was selfhood. The reward was belonging. And so Mirkwood endured, not as it was, not as it had been hoped to remain, but as something entirely itself. A forest that had accepted every fracture, every failure, every echo, and woven them into a final living pattern. The light that filtered through Mirkwood now was no longer golden, nor was it dark. It was pale and diffused, a silvered hush that draped the forest in a kind of quiet permanence. There was no longer any distinction between morning and dusk within the deeper groves, only a slow, unchanging twilight that shimmered along the edges of perception. The trees had thickened their silence. The paths, once shifting like memory, had begun to disappear entirely. What remained was less a place than a rhythm, and those who entered did so not to navigate, but to be enveloped. The cursed heart no longer pulsed from the center. Its resonance had stretched outward, diluted into the bark, the soil, the air. Mirkwood itself had become the vessel for what had once been confined, and though the spiral still marked the center, still hidden, still present, there was no longer any need to guard it. No one could reach it now, not because it resisted intrusion, but because it no longer needed. Those who lingered near the old perimeters spoke of strange shifts in sound. The wind, though soft, carried no echo. Footsteps, even heavy ones, failed to disturb the undergrowth. It was as if the forest had softened all edges, absorbed all friction, becoming smooth and continuous. Travelers described the sense of walking through someone else's recollection, a memory vast enough to walk in, but too deep to touch. There were no more guardians, only echoes of them. One by one their names faded from use. The songs they once sang were absorbed into the calls of unseen birds. Their sigils appeared in moss patterns or in the branching of lichen along fallen logs. A few who lived beyond the forest's reach claimed to see faces in the bark, calm, open, always watching. But when they returned to find them again, the bark was smooth, the faces gone as if they had only ever existed in the corner of the eye. A single brook still flowed from the forest, cold and clear, winding northward through the hills. It was said that if you drank from it at dawn, you would dream of a tree you had never seen, whose roots held something precious and still breathing. No one who followed the brook back to its origin ever returned with clarity. They came back quiet, unable to explain what they had seen or why they had wept. And so it was that Mirkwood ceased to be a place marked by danger or destination. It was no longer described in terms of direction or hazard. Instead, it became known through impression, a place people remembered without having visited, a hush that found its way into conversation without name, a curve in thought, a shadow behind old stories, a rhythm too slow to hear except in solitude. The forest had not claimed the world. It had not spread like fire or flood. It had simply withdrawn, leaving behind a faint tremor of presence wherever silence was allowed to bloom. In forgotten wells, in empty halls, in the stillness of deep cellars, it could sometimes be felt that breathless moment where thought falters and time bends slightly. And always, just beneath that moment, the softest hum. The world adjusted. Kings no longer sent hunters beyond its borders. Maps redrew themselves without resistance. The forest remained on the page, but unmarked. It had earned its stillness, not through violence, but through the weight of its remembering. In a town to the south, an archivist compiled what remained: tales, drawings, fragments of speech. She worked alone, mostly at night. Her fingers stained with ink and her ears often turned to the trees beyond her window. One night, while reading an account of the last accord, she paused mid-sentence and wrote something new in the margin. The forest is not growing darker, it is growing whole. She could not explain why, but the sentence felt truer than anything else she had recorded. She never published her work. Instead, she left the manuscript on her windowsill and vanished one spring morning, the shutters creaking behind her. A sapling later grew beneath that sill, its bark a pale gray, its leaves silver-veined and strangely warm to the touch. No one cut it down. Mirkwood did not demand reverence. It did not require witness. It had long since outgrown the need to be interpreted or resolved. It was what remained when story and silence became one. A forest that had survived itself, not by resisting change, but by absorbing it, by becoming the consequence of every oath broken, every shadow misunderstood, every name whispered with both hope and fear. And now, in its twilight fullness, Mirkwood no longer waited to be seen. It waited to be remembered. It began with a rumor, faint, uncertain, passed like a thread through border villages and worn trade routes, never named outright. A child had spoken in her sleep of a door in the forest, carved not by hands but by time itself. She had never been to Mirkwood. Her family had never whispered its name, and yet she drew it with charcoal, an arch of roots, twisted and interlaced, forming a shape that pulsed with something older than craft. No keyhole, no lock, just a doorway that watched. The drawing found its way to a scholar, who folded it carefully and placed it among a stack of forgotten letters. But it did not stay still. By dusk, the charcoal had spread across the paper, lines thickening into rings, like growth within a tree trunk. When she touched it, the paper felt warm. That winter, other stories followed. A herd of deer pausing at the forest's edge, not from fear, but reverence. Travelers waking to find moss on their boots despite sleeping miles away. Lanterns extinguishing at once when pointed toward a particular grove. A hunter claimed he saw a gate made of nothing but wind, suspended between two ancient oaks. He tried to pass through. He came back with his hands covered in pollen and his voice changed to a whisper that never rose. What Mirkwood had once concealed it now began to reveal, but only in suggestion, never in The last accord had not severed Mirkwood from the world. It had changed its manner of conversation. The forest no longer repelled. It beckoned, not loudly, not to all, but to those with memory in their blood. Those who had heard the old names in lullaby, those who had walked the edge and felt something tug, not their body, but their story. And it was these few who began to speak of the forest, not as danger, not even as myth, but as inheritance. Among them was a girl named Neris, raised in a town that no longer marked Mirkwood on its maps. She had never seen its edge, never been taught its songs, and yet each night her dreams unfurled beneath towering branches, and the wind carried voices that knew her name. When she walked alone, stones aligned beneath her steps. When she wept, saplings bent in her direction. She did not ask questions, she simply followed. By her 14th year she had vanished. No search was called. Those in her village woke with a strange calm, as though they had known it would happen, as though her absence was not loss, but pass. And in the clearing where she had last been seen, there grew a ring of low trees, their bark silver-veined, their leaves the color of faded ink. They bore no fruit, no flower, but when the wind passed through, it carried a rhythm, not a tune, not a voice, but a memory, as if something had remembered itself. In time, these events ceased to be questioned. The world did not forget Mirkwood, but it no longer challenged it. Its presence was accepted, like the changing of light or the spaces between stars. Roads curved away from it without resistance. Maps omitted its outline not from ignorance, but from respect. It had become a truth beneath language. What few understood was that Mirkwood had never desired isolation. Its retreat had been a gathering of silence, of memory, of the names that could not survive in open air. And now, in its fullness, it had begun to share, not by speaking, but by becoming readable only to those who could already understand. Within the forest, something shifted. The trees no longer echoed the past. They began to fold it, to compress it into root and bark and breath. The glades held stories not of ruin, but of transformation. The pools reflected not sky, but lineage, and the wind, always soft, moved like a hand through pages not yet turned. There were no guardians, no rituals, no maps, only resonance. It was said that if you walked the forest in silence, it would reveal a single truth to you, never in word, never in form, but in pattern. Some saw it in the flight of moths, others in the alignment of fallen branches. But all who received it returned altered, not enlightened, not marked, simply quieter, more certain of where they had been, even if they could no longer say what they had seen. The forest did not keep them, it never had, but it gave something in return. A question always the same, nested beneath each dream, each echo, each breath. Do you know what you carry? And though no one answered aloud, the forest listened just the same. There was a stillness that came after the forest stopped needing to explain itself. It was not the stillness of endings, nor the hush of abandonment. It was deeper, like a breath held just long enough for the world to forget it had ever been exhaled. Mirkwood, in its final form, no longer shifted to warn, to protect, or to conceal. It simply was full and entire, not waiting for recognition, but moving quietly beneath the rhythm of forgetting. The door that the child had once drawn, etched from dream and myth, appeared now not in a single place, but in many. Not a structure, not a gate of bark and stone, but a threshold, a feeling that gathered in the air just before a path narrowed, a curve in the light where branches bent into improbable geometry, a moment when sound thickened and every breath tasted of memory. Those who reached it did not step through. They softened into it, like stories returning to their root. By now the stories of Mirkwood had scattered across the world in fragments, unanchored from time, recited not as warnings but as riddles. No one knew who had first spoken them, and no one cared. They were not lessons, they were echoes. The forest had become a question too large for words, and so its answers passed through gesture, song, silence, and the way certain people look toward the horizon with a tremble in their voice. In the northern villages, children grew up tracing spirals in frost-covered windows, without knowing why. They whispered to birds who answered in patterns older than language. In markets, traders told of dreams they couldn't escape, dreams in which they stood beneath trees they'd never seen, listening for names they had never spoken. And on quiet nights, elders hummed lullabies that had no known origin, their notes shaped like the curve of a forgotten glade. None of this was claimed as fact. No temple rose in Mirkwood's honor, no doctrine emerged. Only small rituals, performed without knowing their root, a hand placed on stone before planting, a bowl of water left out during a new moon, a line of salt broken before sleep. These gestures belonged to no faith, no law, yet those who practiced them slept a little more soundly. And when they dreamed of trees. Back within the wood, change had slowed. The forest had found its shape. The trees, once strained by the resonance of the curse at heart, now bent in quiet agreement. The shadows were no longer dense, only deep. They no longer whispered in riddles. They hummed like old verses forgotten in the middle of speech. Pools held no reflection, not because they were cursed, but because they no longer needed to show anything at all. They existed without reference, and in the center, where no map could reach, the spiral remained, neither source nor destination, but a rhythm around which the rest of the forest breathed. No footsteps approached it now, yet it was never empty. It held something like presence, something like story, layered in roots and layered again in silence. In the final years of record, a letter was found, unsigned, tucked inside the folds of an abandoned archive. The handwriting was precise, the ink faded but unbroken. It read, "I walked until the world no longer asked my name. I passed beneath limbs that had watched me grow old without ever learning my face. And when I reached the place where time softened, I did not ask what it meant. I only listened. The forest did not answer. It allowed me to remain." That letter is now kept beneath glass in a hall that bears no title. Visitors come not to read it, but to sit beside it in silence. Some stay minutes, some hours. No explanation is offered. None is required. The forest has become a place no longer bound by boundary. It exists wherever it is remembered, and it is remembered in more places than anyone will ever know. At last, there are no paths left to chart, no lines to draw, only echoes gently folding back into the spiral. Mirkwood no longer needs watchers. It no longer needs myths. It is not waiting to be rediscovered, nor is it vanishing. It is simply returning to itself endlessly, slowly, completely. And beneath its canopy, where light has long since become something softer than vision, the leaves continue to stir, not in wind, but in memory. Some say that if you stand at the forest's edge just before dawn, and the mist lies low across the moss, you can hear it, the last breath of a story that never needed to be told aloud. Not a voice, not a cry, but a memory exhaled into air, so still it barely stirs the leaves. And though there are no paths left, no markers, no guardians to speak your name, Mirkwood will know you. Not by footfall, but by presence. Not by lineage, but by resonance. For the forest remembers differently now. It does not recall in sequence, nor does it favor beginnings or endings. Instead, it gathers every echo into the spiral, allowing time to fold over itself. The first oath and the final surrender sit side by side beneath root and stone. The laughter of a guardian long forgotten hums beneath the stillness of a pool that never reflects. And in this way, Mirkwood has become not a place to enter, but a place to return to, whether you've walked its glades or only dreamed of its name. The door, if it was ever truly a door, is gone now, or rather, it has dissolved into the world. The spiral has uncoiled and threaded itself into the very fabric of forgotten places, a circle etched into a barn floor by accident, a curve in the grain of an old tabletop, a child's finger drawn in dust without knowing why. Each a trace of the memory Mirkwood has become, each a signal, quiet and patient, that the story is still unfolding. No scholar remains who speaks the forest's former names. The records, where they exist, have yellowed into unreadable margins, the ink faded like breath on glass. What lingers are impressions, a hush that falls too suddenly, a tree that seems to listen, a dream of branches that do not move, but change position between blinks. Those who experience these things rarely speak of them directly, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The forest does not require witness, it only asks for stillness. Some who pass near the old boundary say they feel lighter afterward, as if something has been quietly removed from them, a weight they never knew they carried. Others leave with a tune caught in their throat, one they cannot place, that returns only when they are alone. A few forget things, small things at first, a face, a date, a direction. Yet what comes in its place is not loss, but quiet, a sense of belonging to something they cannot name. And in rare moments, very rare, someone returns changed. They are not marked, not glowing with forest light or branded with glyphs of forgotten speech. No, their change is subtler. They walk slower, they pause more often. Their eyes carry the sheen of a question long considered, never spoken. When asked, they smile, but it is a smile that does not invite further inquiry. It is the smile of someone who has seen the root beneath the root, who has walked the spiral all the way in and all the way back. A traveler once carved a phrase into a stone at the edge of an overgrown path. It is weathered now, half swallowed by moss, but if you run your fingers along the grooves, you can still feel it. It never wanted to be a forest, only a place where memory could rest. No one knows who wrote it. Some say it was a child grown old. Others say it was the forest itself, speaking through borrowed hands. And so Mirkwood lives, not as a danger to avoid, nor a myth to unravel, but as a condition of the world, a place that teaches without speaking, that alters not the earth beneath your feet, but the silence you carry inside. There are no endings here, only invitations to listen more deep. In the end, the story of Mirkwood is not about what it became. It is about what it allowed others to become in its presence. A mirror, a question, a place to lay down all that was carried and walk onward lighter, if less certain. And if ever you find yourself standing at the edge of some forgotten grove, unsure why the light seems different there, why the trees lean as if listening, and why the wind carries no sound at all, then pause. Do not speak, do not move, let the silence rise. And if it hums, if it presses gently against your chest like a memory too old to name, then you will know.